So no appeal to design is necessary to explain fine-tuning. It's pure chance. First response to the many worlds hypothesis. One way to respond to the many worlds hypothesis would be to show that the multiverse itself also involves fine-tuning. For in order to be scientifically credible, some plausible mechanism must be suggested for generating the many worlds. But if the many worlds hypothesis is to be successful in attributing fine-tuning to chance alone, then the mechanism that generates the many worlds had better not be fine-tuned itself. For if it is, then the problem arises all over again. How do you explain the fine-tuning of the multiverse? The proposed mechanisms for generating a world ensemble are so vague that it's far from clear that the physics governing the multiverse will not involve any fine-tuning. For example, if M-theory is the physics of the multiverse, then it remains unexplained, as we've seen, why exactly 11 dimensions exist. And the mechanism that actualizes all the possibilities in the cosmic landscape may involve fine-tuning. So the postulate of a world ensemble is by itself not enough to justify the alternative of chance. A backhanded compliment to design. The current debate over fine-tuning has now become a debate over the many worlds hypothesis. In order to explain the fine-tuning we're being asked to believe, not merely that there are other unobservable universes, but there is an infinite number of such worlds, and that they randomly vary in their fundamental constants and quantities. All this is needed to guarantee that a life-permitting universe like ours will appear by chance in the ensemble. The many worlds hypothesis is really a sort of backhanded compliment to the design hypothesis. For otherwise sober scientists would not be flocking to adopt so speculative and extravagant a view as the many worlds hypothesis unless they felt absolutely compelled to. So if someone says to you, the fine-tuning could have happened by chance, or the improbable happens, or it was just dumb luck, ask him, then why do the detractors of design feel compelled to embrace an extravagance like the many worlds hypothesis in order to avoid design? Second response to the many worlds hypothesis. Moreover, many theorists are skeptical of the many worlds hypothesis itself. Why think that a world ensemble actually exists? We saw in Chapter 4 that the Borde-Guth-Vilakin theorem requires that even a multiverse of bubble universes must have a beginning. In that case, the mechanism that generates the bubble universes has been chugging away for only a finite amount of time. So by now, there may well be only a finite number of bubbles in the world ensemble, which may not be enough to guarantee the appearance of a finely tuned universe by chance alone. There's no evidence that the sort of world ensemble required by the many worlds hypothesis actually exists. By contrast, we have a good independent reasons for believing in a designer of the cosmos, as Leibniz and Al-Ghazali's arguments show. Third response to the many worlds hypothesis. Moreover, the many worlds hypothesis faces what may be a devastating objection. Remember Boltzmann's many worlds hypothesis discovered in Chapter 4? What sank Boltzmann's hypothesis was the fact that if our world is just a random member of a world ensemble, then it's vastly more probable that we should be observing a much smaller region of order. It turns out that a parallel problem faces the many worlds hypothesis as an explanation of cosmic fine-tuning. Talk about it. Given the flaws in the many worlds hypothesis, why do you think so many people prefer to believe in chance rather than in a designer? Roger Penrose has pressed this objection forcefully. He points out that the odds of our universe's initial low entropy conditions existing by chance alone are 1 chance out of 10 to the 10th power times the 123rd power. By contrast, the odds of our solar system suddenly forming by the random collision of particles is 1 chance out of 10 to the 10th power times the 60th power. This number, says Penrose, is utter chicken feed in comparison with 10 to the 10th power times the 123rd power. What that means is that it is far more likely that we should be observing an orderly universe, no larger than our solar system, since a world of that size is unfathomably more probable than a fine-tuned universe like ours. In fact, we wind up with the same sort of illusionism that saddled Boltzmann's hypothesis. A small world with the illusion of a wider, orderly universe is more probable than a fine-tuned real universe. Carried to its logical extreme, this has led to what theorists have called the invasion of the Boltzmann brains. For the most probable observable universe is one that consists of a single brain that pops into existence by a random fluctuation with illusory perceptions of the orderly cosmos. So if you accept the many worlds hypothesis, you're obligated to believe that you are all that exists, and that this book, your body, the earth, and everything you perceive in the world are just illusions. No sane person believes that he is a Boltzmann brain. Given atheism, therefore, it's highly improbable that there exists a randomly ordered world ensemble. Ironically, the best hope for partisans of the multiverse is to maintain that God created it and ordered its worlds, so that they're not randomly ordered. God could give preference to observable worlds that are cosmically fine-tuned. To be rationally acceptable, the many worlds hypothesis needs God. With the failure of the many worlds hypothesis, the last ring of defense for the alternative of chance collapses. Neither physical necessity nor chance provides a good explanation of the fine-tuning of the universe. Design. Dawkins' objection. So what about design? Is this explanation better than physical necessity or chance, or is it equally implausible? Detractors of design sometimes object that on this hypothesis, the cosmic designer himself remains unexplained. This objection is what Richard Dawkins calls the central argument of my book, The God Delusion. He summarizes his argument as follows. 1. One of the greatest challenges to the human intellect has been to explain how the complex, improbable appearance of design in the universe arises. 2. The natural temptation is to attribute the appearance of design to actual design itself. 3. The temptation is a false one because the designer hypothesis immediately raises the larger problem of who designed the designer. 4. The most ingenious and powerful explanation is Darwinian evolution by natural selection. 5. We don't have an equivalent explanation for physics. 6. We should not give up the hope of a better explanation arising in physics, something as powerful as Darwinism is for biology. Therefore, God almost certainly does not exist. Invalidity of Dawkins' argument. The conclusion doesn't follow. Dawkins' argument is jarring because the atheistic conclusion, therefore God almost certainly does not exist, doesn't follow from the 6 previous statements, even if we can see that each of them is true. There are no rules of logic that would permit such an inference. Dawkins' argument is plainly invalid. At most, all that follows from Dawkins' argument is that we should not infer God's existence on the basis of the appearance of design in the universe. But that conclusion is quite compatible with God's existence, and even with our justifiably believing in God's existence. Maybe we should believe in God on the basis of the cosmological argument or the moral argument. Maybe our belief in God isn't based on arguments at all, but is grounded in religious experience or in divine revelation. The point is that rejecting design arguments for God's existence does nothing to prove that atheism is true or that belief in God is unjustified. Dawkins' lack of philosophical depth is plainly on display here. Naturalism. Naturalism is the belief that only natural explanations, as opposed to supernatural ones, should be considered. Because a designer is defined as supernatural, beyond nature, naturalism rules out this explanation, regardless of evidence. Falsity of Dawkins' premises. But does Dawkins' argument succeed even in undermining the argument for design? Not at all, for several of the steps of Dawkins' argument are plausibly false. Step 5 refers to the cosmic fine-tuning that has been the focus of our discussion. Dawkins has nothing by way of explanation for it, and therefore the hope expressed in step 6 represents nothing more than the faith of a naturalist. Moreover, consider step 3. Dawkins' claim here is that we are not justified in inferring design as the best explanation of the complex order of the universe, because then a new problem arises. Who designed the designer? First problem with step 3. You don't need to explain the explanation. This claim is flawed on at least 2 counts. First, in order to recognize an explanation as the best, you don't need to have an explanation of the explanation. This is an elementary point in the philosophy of science. If archaeologists digging in the earth were to discover things looking like arrowheads and pottery shards, they would be justified in inferring that these artifacts are not the chance result of sedimentation and metamorphosis, but products of some unknown group of people, even though they had no explanation of who these people were or where they came from. Similarly, if astronauts were to come upon a pile of machinery on the backside of the moon, they would be justified in inferring that it was the product of intelligent agents, even if they had no idea whatsoever who these agents were or how they got there. So in order to recognize an explanation as the best, you don't need to be able to explain the explanation. In fact, such a requirement would lead to an infinite regress of explanations, so that nothing could ever be explained, and science would be destroyed. For before any explanation could be acceptable, you'd need an explanation of it, and then an explanation of the explanation, and then nothing could ever be explained. So in the case at hand, in order to recognize that intelligent design is the best explanation of the appearance of design in the universe, one needn't be able to explain the designer. Whether the designer has an explanation can simply be left an open question for future inquiry. Second problem with step 3. God is remarkably simple. Second, Dawkins thinks that in the case of a divine designer of the universe, the designer is just as complex as the thing to be explained, so that no explanatory advance is made. This objection raises all sorts of questions about the role played by simplicity in assessing competing explanations. For example, there are many other factors besides simplicity that scientists weigh in determining which explanation is the best, such as explanatory power, explanatory scope, and so forth. An explanation that has broader explanatory scope may be less simple than a rival explanation, but still be preferred because it explains more things. Simplicity is not the only or even most important criterion for assessing theories. But leave those questions aside. Dawkins' fundamental mistake lies in his assumption that a divine designer is just as complex as the universe. That is plainly false. As a pure mind without a body, God is a remarkably simple entity. A mind, or soul, is not a physical object composed of parts. In contrast to the contingent and varied universe with all its inexplicable contents and quantities, a divine mind is startlingly simple. Certainly such a mind may have complex ideas. It may be thinking, for example, of the infinitesimal calculus. But the mind itself is a remarkably simple spiritual entity. Dawkins has evidently confused a mind's ideas, which may indeed be complex, with the mind itself, which is an incredibly simple entity. Therefore, postulating a divine mind behind the universe most definitely does represent an advance in simplicity, for whatever that's worth. Talk about it. Given the flaws in Dawkins' reasoning, how do you account for the huge popularity of his book? More than 1.5 million copies sold. What other than logic might explain its popular appeal? Other steps in Dawkins' argument are also problematic, but I think enough has been said to show that his argument does nothing to undermine the fine-tuning argument for a cosmic designer, not to speak of its serving as a justification of atheism. Several years ago, the atheist philosopher Quentin Smith unceremoniously crowned Stephen Hawking's argument against God in A Brief History of Time as the worst atheistic argument in the history of Western thought. With the advent of the God delusion, the time has come, I think, to relieve Hawking of this weighty crown and to recognize Richard Dawkins' ascension to the throne.